This is the story of Lorbas, our Griffon friend who, with the help of our veterinarians, we were allowed to enjoy for 12 years. But we start with Fritz, his older, senior Griffon friend, because he had a decisive influence on Lorbas. Fritz loves blankies. And every once in a while, when we feel rich, we go to the Salvation Army and look for one. And this one he got just a few minutes ago. And he is sort of digesting the fact that it's his. And once he understands that it is his, he knows that he can do with it whatever he wants, and he can love it to pieces, literally. And that's what he does. He does this with nothing else but his blankies. He chews them up. He eats them. It is 5 o'clock in the morning. A single woof from Fritz wakes me up. I jump out of bed while Chris manages to continue sleeping. It is pouring rain. Our doe has taken shelter under the Douglas firs in front of our window. I go through our morning routine adopted since mid-April. I let Fritz, our 12-year-old Griffon, and Lorbas, our Griffon baby, out of the house, feed them, let them look after their bodily needs, and invite them back inside. They quickly settle down again, and it's usually 2 or 3 more hours of sleep for everybody. After that, we entertain and train Lorbas. Initially, we walked the property in order to acquaint Lorbas with his new home. A lot of time we spent with Fritzie's sheep. They are really the sheep of our neighbor Jeff, and they have only recently come on the rear part of our property, which we lease to Jeff. But Fritz quickly became very fond of them. He can spend hours lying with his nose to the fence and admiring his sheep. I'm sure he would love to have his own lamb, and that he would take good, loving care of it. Maybe he would love it to pieces, just as he does with his blankies. And it seems as if the sheep reciprocate his affection. Lorbas, however, is not very interested in the sheep. Grass amuses him at least as much. After a week of this, I got bored with the routine at home and started to take Fritz and Lorbas out to our beautiful regional parks. Tower Point quickly became my favorite. Tower Point is a promontory of rock, providing a splendid view of the Olympic Mountains in Washington on the other side of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The park has a nice meadow, a bit of tall tree forest, incredibly steep abysses of rock, and extensive tidal flats. Tower Point is surrounded by rocky islands of granite or basalt carved out 10,000 years ago by the glaciers. There is plenty of wildlife. Seals can be seen basking on the rocks and swimming. fish otters fish in front of the cliffs. So do loons. Pretty harlequin ducks pass in front of us. Geese are abundant in pairs and with their offspring, watchful and territorial. Clouds of gulls rise from the tidal flats. There are several pairs of eagles in the vicinity, often attacked by gulls or crows. And plenty of songbirds inhabit the wooded parts and shrubbery. White-crowned sparrows, song sparrows, house finches, red-winged blackbirds, and many warblers. And then there is the delight of wildflowers, some singly and in spaces where one has to search for them, such as the chocolate lilies. Others in abundant profusion, such as the Easter lilies, the delphiniums, and above all the blue camas lilies. The tidal flats harbor a myriad of creatures, scores beyond the many kinds of clams and the occasional oyster. Lorbas delights in playing with rock crabs, which quickly bury themselves after I rescue them. But Lorbas is at the beginning of his life. Everything is new to him. He is delirious at the discovery of very common things, like sand, and exuberant about playing in it with stones or one of his squeaky toys. Lorbas cannot resist exploring the infinite nooks and crannies, the rocks and crevices, and the endless animal trails under the bushes and through the forest. He delights in exploring the abysses, making the hair on my neck stand up, and my heart stop when he ventures so close to the abyss. But he never slips, never gets into a calamity, and becomes more and more as agile as a little goat. For Lorbas, the greatest thing about Tower Point is likely that it is a place for endless encounters with other dogs and their owners. After a while, when some of us meet, we just go to the meadow on top of the hill and let the dogs cavort to their heart's content. The meadow is covered with ribwort plantain in bloom, and the dogs release clouds of pollen when they race through it. Well, those were the happy days with Fritz and Lorbas at Tower Point in 2011. But somehow, not everybody's experiences at Tower Point were happy and positive. Chris and I had to devote a lot of attention to Lorbas in order to show him how to behave and prevent him from getting into trouble. Lorbas also received 3 meals a day, Fritz only 2, and we got Lorbas toys, lots of them. On top of that, Lorbas happily and nonchalantly usurped Fritzy's space, adopted shreds of his most recent and most cherished blankies, plunked himself down in Fritzy's bedding space, and whenever we wanted to cuddle Fritz, Lorbas interfered. Fritz clearly thought that Lorbas was a pest. Soon, Fritz showed signs that he felt neglected, and after a week he ended up in a profound depression. He retired listlessly to his bed, gave us no tail wag whatsoever, lay with a sorrowful look in his face on his pillow, and when I covered him with the blanket that Shannon had given him, he didn't even budge. We were quite alarmed. We sent an emergency request to our friends Bob and Elaine, asking them to come as soon as possible with Rogan, the poodle, who is Fritzy's best friend. And they came. Fritz and Rogan had a good romp in the meadow. Fritzy got another splendid blankie, and we made sure that Lorbas respected Fritzy's resting space and Fritzy's sphere and belongings. And after a few days, Fritzy was back to his usual joyful self. Lots of tail wags again. But every morning he also demands with a special bark that he and I make love on the carpet. I cuddle him and hold him tight and tell him that he is the bestest Fritz we ever had. Then he is content. But of late, Fritz also refuses to go to Tower Point with us. I think he has had enough. So the joint excursions to Tower Point may be a thing of the past. Lorbas, meanwhile, develops splendidly. He doubled his weight since we got him, and he obviously, patently, and unmistakably enjoys life. His capacity for mischief is as great as his capacity for happiness. So far, he has not eaten any expensive slippers or done any other noteworthy destruction. He points at birds, sparrows, robins, crows, you name it. He constantly uses his nose, munches up his chew toys, and eventually, finally, rests. This is Lorbas, now at 7 months. He has developed a close friendship with Flap, the rescue dog next door, and both his mom and his dad, she's a vet, he is a farmer, are very happy when Lorbas comes over. And those two rolled around for hours on end. And every dog gets home relaxed and happy. But the greatest passion of Lorbas is his ball. He plays with it for hours when he is not allowed to go out and play with Flap.
Trying to tell me, Lorbas, huh?
And the greatest thing is, of course, when we play chuck-it ball, and he comes
to go and play with
and
the ball.
pines for the ball in the throwing device and entices me to go out and do another round of a number of retrieves with him. I can throw the ball probably for 100, 120 meters, and he always happily and greedily brings it back, and we can do it again. And every once in a while we try to cheat him so that he doesn't know where the ball went, and then he has to search it. That's what Chris does here. Now he has to search it, and it's beautiful to see how he eagerly looks for the ball, and he uses his nose exclusively to find it. It took him about 4 weeks to learn that if he looked where the ball went in the air, it would speed up his retrieve. Here's another search for the ball in the hay, but he almost always finds it.
Thank you, Lorbas.
So today
Great.
we tried another thing. We went out into East Zug Park, where the grass is very high, and we did a number of retrieves to his great delight. And again, we threw the ball sometimes into the very high grass, and he was able to find it. This is a quick retrieve right from the path where he was able to see where the ball went. But here I was throwing it into the grass. It's in the grass where he runs to, and then he retrieves it with his nose eagerly and comes back with it. And then we tried yet another thing, and we went to the pond where he had to retrieve the ball from the water, where of course he can't smell it, at least not as well as in the grass. And he has to develop different approaches to grabbing it, and he plays around with it a little bit. But eventually he brings it back as well.
Good, Lorbas, good.
And given that, we tried to go to the salt chuck and see how we could do there, and whether we could entice him to swim, because the little pond where our previous dog Theo learned to swim wasn't deep enough in the middle of the drought in the summer. So I started by throwing the ball just to the shore a little bit, and he retrieved it from there, and then into the water where he could easily get to it. Again, he has to search for it and realize that he has to look for it rather than to smell for it. But he brings it back, and then I progressively throw it out a little further.
Good, Lorbas. Thank you.
So now I throw it to a place where he basically has to swim, and he tries to figure out how to get to the ball. He goes to and fro, and finally starts to swim towards it, but then he chickens out
Good.
and returns.
Great.
And now I throw it really deep in, and now he goes for it, and he swims. Now he swims, and he tries to grab the ball in the water, and finally succeeds,
Lorbas.
and swims back with the ball.
Great, Lorbas.
And then, for compensation, he's allowed to play with the ball in the sand. So we're now about 2.5 months, no, 1.5, since we found out that Lorbas has hip dysplasia. And on these pictures, which were taken before the diagnosis, one can see how he hardly uses his right hind leg. We then started to treat him with acupuncture. Here, a few needles in his rear thigh, and with drugs, and we give him a lot of exercise. Often we go to Matheson Lake, where he is exuberant when we are playing with his ball. He retrieves the ball and I throw it as far as I can, which is probably something like 50 or 70 meters. And he retrieves it joyfully, and we do about 5 of these retrieves, one after the other. No, not one after the other. In between he plays with the ball on the beach. At any rate, he loves this, and it seems to do him good. Here he comes back with his ball, and somewhere he loses it. Now the ball is swimming behind him, but as soon as he's back on the beach, he returns, finds the ball, and goes and retrieves it again. I think it shows that he definitely enjoys life, and our veterinarians have suggested that we do this kind of exercise with him rather than running with other dogs or running with the ball in the field, because this strengthens the muscles and doesn't put as much strain on his hips. And then he plays with his ball, rolls it up the rocks, down again, over my knee, and he puts it in this pit which he has dug again and again, and digs it out. So I think it shows that he is definitely enjoying life, and maybe it is even a testimony to the efficacy of the treatment. Whether it's the drugs or the acupuncture or both is of course hard to decide, but we are happy that he has this gain in enjoyment in life. And of course, under these conditions, we want to keep him. Lorbas had made it to 2 years of age. And so, on the advice of our veterinarians, we proceeded to surgical treatment of his hip dysplasia. The recommendation was a femoral head and neck arthroplasty. This is a gruelling procedure where the surgeon removes the head and neck of the femur and thus eliminates the painful bone-on-bone interaction, and hence the cause of the pain. The rest of the femur is left dangling in soft tissue, free to develop a pseudo-joint. It took Lorbas only 3 weeks to recover from surgery. After a mere 4 weeks, he was back to his favorite sport, ball playing. We took him to the ocean, so that swimming would spare his joints sudden stress. A mere 3 months after the surgery, he jumped again vigorously and high for the ball, and regularly did many retrieves of his beloved ball from the lake, often 20 at a time, the equivalent of some 3,000 meters of swimming. In between retrieves he plays with the ball by himself. Left paw against right paw against nose is a great game, particularly if you pretend that the left paw doesn't know what the right paw does. There is no doubt that he is happy, and so are we. Thanks to Dr. Sukiani of Brentwood Bay Veterinary Clinic in Victoria, BC. We cannot believe that once we thought we had to put him down because of his ailment. There is no end to Lorbas' capacity for playing ball. If we don't initiate the game, he tries to entice us to play. A standard version of the game is to throw the ball across the house so that he has to search for it. Sometimes we are able to fool him as to the direction of the cast. Then he has to search large areas. He searches beautifully and vigorously, relying almost exclusively on his nose. A whiff of the ball tears him around and turns him to decipher the exact location from which he happily and proudly retrieves the ball. After a few retrieves of this kind, it is time for a rest in the shade and for pure, undisturbed and uninterrupted enjoyment of the possession of the prized ball. Over the years, Lorbas invented exciting variations of the game. Left paw against right paw against nose is a favorite one, particularly if played on steep rocks by the lake. Although never afraid of racing into the water from a beach, he had initially great trepidations with entering the water from a rock. It took him much agonizing and several weeks to learn that it is possible to go left or right in order to find shallow axes and reach his beloved prize. He has yet to learn that he could just jump in at certain places, and that is probably also good. Despite all his trepidations, this game is so much fun that he never tires of it. Lorbas comes from a breed of superb hunting dogs. If it were not for his hip dysplasia, he would have made a great breeding dog. Watching him retrieve balls shows already what a great retriever he is. He never misses an opportunity to hunt. Butterflies, dragonflies, fish, anything and all interest him. In the meadow, he often amuses himself with finding voles or small rodents. Sometimes he catches one. Then he plays with it, often not doing much harm. A big chum salmon in the river really puzzled him.
His passion are birds, quail for sure, but even the sparrows in the rhodos, the robins nesting in the rhodos or under the deck. They keep him busy and occupied for weeks. Rabbits, of course, are a real prize. We do not tolerate them because they proliferate so rapidly and then can do real damage to our garden operation. Lorbas has learned to watch for rabbits, which often materialize in front of the big cedar across the lawn. If he sees one there, he notifies me, and if I'm able to shoot it, he retrieves it with me. In this instance, I was sure I had missed a small rabbit. But Lorbas went after it, and after a bit appeared with the tiny animal. So, with a bag of sometimes a dozen rabbits per season, his superb hunting talent is not entirely wasted. Initially, Fritz clearly considered Lorbas somewhat of a nuisance. That changed, however, as Fritz grew older. Turning 14 and then reaching almost 16 years of age, dear old Fritz became blind, largely deaf, and developed serious joint pains. So we all had to care for him. At that time, Fritz and Lorbas reconciled. Fritz may even have grown fond of Lorbas. With Fritz making it clear that he did not care for his rambunctiousness, sometimes in a not too subtle way, Lorbas decreased his attempts at enticing Fritz to play. Instead, during Fritz's last year, Lorbas developed a routine of taking the old Fritz out for a walkabout on our property. The routine was to take Fritz down to the end of the property and back up. No one had instructed him to do so. He just did it, every day. Lorbas would take the lead and Fritz would follow him. Across the lawn, then down the driveway towards the road. They never went on the road. Both knew that going on the road was a no-no. So, from down at the end of the property, both returned via the driveway. Lorbas ahead, Fritz in tow. Fritz had assumed the gait of a blind dog, lifting his front paws high up while walking, so as not to bump into things. Unfortunately, that did not prevent him from bumping into my car and me driving over him. That was his end, to all our deep regret, including Lorbas, who seriously grieved for several days. Thank heaven Lorbas has a new friend. This is Popeye, a miniature schnauzer who, with Debbie and Glenn, lives in the cottage. Lorbas wakes up from his sleep when Popeye comes outside. Popeye wears a little bell around his neck, and though none of us is able to hear anything, Lorbas wakes up from his sleep, and he races to greet him and Debbie, who indulges Lorbas with ball playing. Life is good again. Well, it is now 2022. Lorbas is 11 years old. We live across the road from our beloved farm in a rented place. Not too bad, 3 acres of nature. And we are surrounded by feral rabbits. Lots of them. Many of them very tame and trusting. And the funny thing is that Lorbas is still interested in them, but being a great pointer, he does not have the instinct to go after them. Instead, he sometimes tries to rather timidly get a little bit closer to them, but he never is aggressively pursuing them. So we are sort of expecting something like a miracle, like a Solus to Paulus conversion, like from a rabbit hunter to a rabbit lover. Let's see how it works out. In my last report on Lorbas developing friendship with the rabbits here, I expressed the naive expectation that they might become real friends, that Lorbas would treat his preferred rabbit as a pet. Even without flashes, would that not have been akin to a Saul to Paul conversion? Would that not have been a perfect addition to the many saccharine videos on YouTube showing wild animals coming to humans in search of help? But nature isn't like that. True, over the course of the year, Lorbas developed more and more specific interactions with one of the many rabbits that we enjoyed as regulars on the premises here. That was a tiny black one, perhaps of vintage 2022. Lorbas spent increasing hours following it at very close range. The rabbit did not seem to mind it. It never ran away, but sometimes escaped under one of the huge cedar hedges on this property. Chris saw Lorbas touch Rabbit with his paw. I only witnessed him sniffing Rabbit's rear end. But was it a lead-up to a lasting friendship, to treating Rabbit as a pet? We may never know, because nature, unscripted, evolves as it would like, not as we would naively like it to. For one thing, Lorbas started becoming rather blasé with the rabbits, losing his excitement over the rabbits, turning his back on them when they were around. But then suddenly, 3 days ago, most of our reliably regular rabbits disappeared completely. Since then, I saw only one silver-gray one and one wild-colored one, both hastily and speedily disappearing. Nothing since. No sign of the several black ones anymore. On the day of the disappearance, I had an interesting encounter with a barred owl perching comfortably on the fence by the driveway when I left for my little walk. Coming back half an hour later, the owl was still there, albeit in a different spot.
Was the owl the cause of the disappearance of the rabbits? Again, we may never know. There are other contenders, for instance a big black cat that we observed prowling the premises for a while now. Or eagles, who after an absence of several months are back again and who we repeatedly observed catching rabbits in the summer.
During his 12th year, Lorbas developed increasing difficulties with getting around. Stairs became impossible obstacles to him. On June 7, Andrew, Chris' brother, spent an afternoon building a very solid ramp for him so he would be able to get into the house. But the next morning he was not able to even get up anymore. So we had to call for the help of Jacob, one of our firefighters. Jacob came and picked him up and put him into the car so we could get him to the veterinary clinic to get him out of his misery. This phase of his life is perfectly caught in the very sensitive Watercolor by Gretchen Markle.